We do to the cloud. You're good? Okay, that's good.
Do the
Yep.
cloud because the
Should be
computer
on my end.
picks up a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Okay. Welcome everyone to this book club. And we're going to be talking about Susan Twight's book, Bless the Birds. And we have a privilege of having the author here with us today. So welcome from Colorado, Susan Twight.
I'm delighted to be here. What fun.
And as book club tradition goes, I have a Padlet to share. And here we go. Is everybody seeing the Padlet? Good. Okay. So we talk a little bit about what is a memoir and what comprises a memoir. And then we go from there with some of Susan's inspiration to write the book, some haiku she includes in the book, and we'll talk about why that is. And then we have some readings. She selected some readings from the book that she'd like to share with us. And then we'll close the hour talking about cultivating terraphilia and about Susan's other work. So I will start with an author's note that Susan wrote about Bless the Birds. This book is a memoir, meaning it is my story, mined from recollections, supported by data from journals, blog posts, and medical records. I've done my best to be accurate and to portray the people and events involved truthfully. I recognize truth as a slippery concept, given that our brains revise our memories to suit our internal narratives. Hence this caveat. This is my take. Others may remember these events differently. I think this is especially true, Susan. What do you think? Because you write about a very emotional time for many people. And I think when our emotions are heightened, our perceptions can really differ more than in a more left brain situation.
I think that's true. And I also think that in a left brain situation, we revise our memories to suit the our perspective on the world. So I think we always the truth in remembered things is always a really slippery concept. Um, Two people can be at the same scientific meeting and remember a discussion differently, for instance, because one person will pick up what interests them and another person will pick up what interests them, and they may have an entirely different recollection of it. So it's always um, it's always important to say, this is what my truth is, but it might not be yours. And as you say, in memoir, it's particularly a big deal because memoir is our personal story, how we see it, and the truths we take out of it.
And some people might wonder what's the difference between a memoir and an autobiography? So this is from uh, I think that you wrote this. Memoirs, like autobiographies, feature the author's subjective account of their life. A memoir, though, is about a specific piece or aspect of the author's life, while an autobiography encompasses that life from birth to death. But both are subjective, both are through that lens. The
Yeah.
sculptor Stefan Novak once said, everyone sees the world through his own green bottle. And I think of that
Yes.
a lot. So
Yes, that's a really good way to put it.
this is your green bottle.
Yes.
And
And I would say memoir is autobiography or biography tends to be an A to Z, a kind of linear recounting of a life. It's attempting to capture a whole life. And memoir, the lovely thing about memoir is it's really about a particular segment or event in a life and the meaning you take from it. So memoir is very dependent on reflection. It's not just a recounting, it's a look. You have to be both the you then and the you now, looking back at it and reflecting on what that means. Memoir without reflection isn't memoir.
I know you've shared with me in the past that it took you 8 years to write this book. So
Yeah.
that's a lot of reflection and perspective.
Well, as you know, in any big event like losing someone you love, it takes a while to find your way past the immediate um, shock and sorrow. Um, and with memoir, it really does need distance. And for me, the distance took a while, but also memoir relies on the tools of fiction in the sense of not making up the story, but on a narrative arc. Something happens in the story and that changes the main character for good or bad. And that narrative arc has to be propelled by the people involved in the story changing and their response to the events that caused them to change. And so it took me a while to figure out what the story was, partly because I'm trained in science. And so my first instinct was to write about it from the left brain sense, all the facts. And when you're writing about, this is a story about living with death, about learning to accept that we all die. And when you're writing about that, there's a lot of medical details you could clutter the story with. And those really aren't the most important thing. The most important thing is that central tension of how do you deal with helping the person you love through their death, which is really what the story is about. And how do you accept that that's a part of life, that we all will die eventually? And how do you rise to be your best self? Well, that's not about the how many MRIs there were, brain scans there were. It's not about those kinds of details. It's about how did the people become the people they are and how did they deal with this crisis and change through it.
And the narrative arc covers uh, your experience with your husband, Richard Cave, as he was diagnosed and then lives with and finally passes from brain cancer. And embedded in that is like a subplot or another aspect of the plot of your mother's journey of
Yeah,
failure to thrive, let's say, and dementia and
yeah.
kind of passing within that. So while you're working through the cancer story with your husband, you lose your mother to those things. So it is a complicated plot within a plot.
And then the framework. So let's make this really complicated. This is called a braided memoir when you do that. So the chronological story begins when my husband sees bird hallucinations and we discover he has brain cancer. And over the course of his 2.25 years of living with glioblastoma, which is grade 4 terminal brain cancer, my mother begins to die. And I midwife both of their deaths, a word that I wouldn't have thought to use for death until a friend suggested it. And it's really apt. I helped them through both of the deaths they wanted at home. I was there actively doing all the things we do when we're taking care of a dying person. Um, but to find the story in that chronological series of events, to find the narrative, I ended up using the framework of the belated honeymoon that Richard and I took in the month and a half before his death. We set off on a 3-week journey from our home in Colorado to the Pacific coast and drove the whole Pacific coast from Washington to Central California and back. A journey that we had never taken a honeymoon. We were grad students when we met, and he was already a dad, and we never had both money and time at the same time. And so we set off, and I'm laughing because nobody in their right mind would do this. We set off, me driving and being nurse and caretaker, set off on a 4,000-mile, 3-week journey through the American West by road with a guy whose right brain was no longer really operational, but he had a great time. He could barely walk, couldn't control his bladder, um, and had a marvelous time. And so that journey is the framework that the two interwoven stories happen within. Um, each chapter begins with a mileage and a day and a place to set and a little vignette from that road trip. We called it the big trip. And it was absolutely insane. I mean, no one should do that. Richard's cancer doc, who was this marvelous woman at the VA in Denver, looked at me when I said we were going to do this thing. And she said, "Okay, I'm going to give you a list of all the VA facilities on the way." And I went, "Oh, you think we'll have problems?"
I,
Yeah.
I I really appreciate how you do organize the chapters, and well, the whole book is contained in the idea of this road trip. Each chapter starts with the odometer reading and the place, and then the vignette, the plot of what's going on. And then you transition in there to, I think you call it a nugget or a gem that relates to something about caring for the earth and the earth nurturing you that gets to an important theme in the book. Can you talk a little bit about the bridges you make to those themes and what that's about for you?
I think one of the tricks in memoir is transitions, if we're going to get nitty-gritty about structure and writing and all that stuff. Being able to go being able to explain who the characters are that you're writing about, and of course they're real people, but they're essentially characters in a story in memoir, and being able to weave yourself back and forth in time and explain what it is that brings meaning to this particular part of your life. And for me, the book is called Bless the Birds for two reasons. One is that if Richard hadn't seen those hallucinatory birds for 24 hours, he saw birds everywhere one morning as we were headed for an artist-writer residency in a remote cabin in the mountains of southwest Colorado. He saw little birds on every blade of grass and every bird's cheek by jowl and every barbed wire fence and big birds on the rims of distant mesas, and they were all hallucinations. And so we didn't go in the residency. If he hadn't seen those birds, we would never have known that he was experiencing massive swelling in his right brain. And he would have died within a couple of weeks, and I would never have known why. He would have just been gone, just like that. Um, and as it was, he saw the birds, and that allowed me to convince him to go to the doctor, and that took us to the VA hospital in Denver, and we found out he had brain cancer. Um, the other reason for the title is that birds were a real thread in his life and mine. I grew up with bird watchers. I'm a botanist, probably in defense, because plants don't get up as early and they hold still when you want to learn who they are. Um, but birds have been a big thread in both of our lives, and they were part of our appreciation for this earth and the sort of connection with nature we had in our everyday lives. And so I bless the birds because we both stayed connected with nature through this journey, and that's what kept both of us caring and compassionate and sort of sane people in a journey with death. Richard was 61 when he died, and I was 55. No one, he was an incredibly healthy person, hale, hearty, muscular, worked with stone. He was a sculptor, um, and no one would have expected him to ever be ill. And so having a daily connection with nature bolstered us through that journey. It gave both of us a sense that there is still hope in the world, even in the hardest times, that there are still reasons to live, even when you're dying, that you can still get up and find small joys and blessings every day. So that was very much that whole idea of how we used our connection with daily nature was very much a part of each chapter in the book to remind us all that there are ways to rise to our best selves in the hardest of times, that nature is something we can lean on. And so there was always, in each chapter, there's some nugget about nature, whether it's about a bird or a plant or whatever, that relates to that particular chapter, where we are in the journey, how we got to be the people we are, and that could take that journey. Does
That
that answer the
reminds
question?
me. Yes, yes, it did. And it's just wonderful to speak to you again. It's been a couple months, and I just love the way you wrap ideas around the words and vice versa. And what you were saying reminded me of this Rainier Maria Rilke epigraph, that one of the ones you use at the beginning of the book. I'm not saying we should love death, but rather that we should love life so generously, without picking and choosing, that we automatically include it, life's other half, in our love.
When I ran across that quote randomly, and I can't remember where, but it's from a letter in a book of his letters. Rainier Maria Rilke was a young German poet who I didn't realize until very recently was first a soldier, and his poetry came out of his war experiences. It's a brilliant, brilliant poet. And when I ran across that quote, I was just stunned because I, as a person who's trained in the natural sciences and has spent a lot of time doing field work in botany, studying ecosystems, death is a part of how I think of life, but I hadn't had the words to articulate why. And that quote just really encapsulated it for me. The idea that we as Westerners, as a culture, are afraid of death. We spend billions of dollars every year pretending we're younger than we are, making ourselves look younger, you know, pretending that we'll never die. We do all sorts of ridiculous things to ward off death, which is a natural ending for our physical bodies. It's part of how we recycle back into the earth. It's where our nutrients go to make space for new lives, to liberate the materials for new lives. But as a culture, we're terrified of it. We don't want to die. And Rilke's words just really encapsulated for me how, no, you don't have to love death. Of course, no one's going to love death. It is not. And I can tell you by experience that being with someone through their death is not necessarily a really easy thing. It's not just you stop breathing and it's all over. Um, it can be grueling. It can be painful. There's all sorts of reasons to not love death, but to deny its existence is to deny our lives, really. And so that quote really spoke to me. That's why I used it as an epigraph. And I was just stunned that in 1923, this German man who is an amazing poet could have said something so profound in a letter. You know, he hadn't rehearsed it. He was just writing.
Writing. And the wonderful writer from, like you, from the Southwest, Terry Tempest Williams, you also use her words. I pray to the birds because they remind me of what I love rather than what I fear. And at the end of my prayers, they teach me how to listen.
That's from Terry's first big book. She had written a book before that, Refuge, which is a memoir. It's one of the earlier natural history memoirs. And I love those lines because I have a broadsheet of them on my wall, printed by a fine press printer who I met at a gathering that another Southwest writer, Gary Nabin, put together years ago. And she was taking snippets of people's work and putting them on broadsheets. And I have that one up on my wall in my living room, actually. And I love that quote because it reminds me that the other lives that we share this planet with have much to teach us, even if they don't speak in our language. And that if we pay attention and listen and feel, we have a lot to learn about how to be more human from all those other lives.
There's this amazing part in your book where Richard's seeing the birds on that day, and you get him to get out of the car with you because they're so real to him. He can't believe you're not seeing them.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, well, let's go. And you walk with him to where he's seeing the birds. He's still seeing them right in front of him. And he reaches to cradle a bird, and his hand passes through the bird.
Yeah.
And that line of Terry's, they teach me how to listen. You listened in that moment. You both listened with that information and got him the diagnosis.
And I will say that I was completely terrified. My absolutely logical, rational, brilliant spouse was seeing thousands of birds in the landscape, and I, who had been raised by bird watchers, couldn't see a bird anywhere. And so when I said, show me, walk over and show me the bird. He reached for the bird. My father banded birds to study them. And he reached for the bird the way my dad had told him that you cradle a bird when you take it out of a mist net. There's a particular way that the bird's head should stick out between your index finger and your thumb, and then you cradle their body very gently with the rest of your hand. And he reached for the bird just as my dad had taught him, and his fingers passed through empty air. And in that moment, he knew that the bird he could see so clearly was not real. And he was part Cherokee Chickasaw and had beautiful cherry wood colored skin, and he turned absolutely ashen pale, something I'd never seen in my life. And he leaned on me. He was about 6 inches taller than me and outweighed me about by 60 pounds. And he leaned on me with his whole weight. And I was absolutely terrified. I mean, our life as I knew it, I didn't know what was going to happen then, but I knew that in that moment, I felt in that moment that our life as we had known it had just taken a turn that was going to take everything we both had. And
I
it did.
get chills again just remembering that moment from your book.
Yeah.
So the span of the book that covers this road trip, and it begins with these odometer readings, this fact-based
Mhm.
numbers place, and it usually ends or near the end, you have a haiku. I put haiku-ish here because you take some liberties with the exact syllables, but basically they are haiku as far as I'm concerned. And so you end with this more poetical, expansive, right brain uh, idea, as sort of a counter bookend to the odometer reading. And I put a few here that I thought we could share, and maybe somebody else would like to read some of these. The haiku from chapter 1. Would anyone like to read that one?
I can read it for you. Put my headset more so you can see it. I can read. So, chapter 1, Owl hoots unanswered, lonely, I wonder, speaking only to a dazzle of stars.
Anyone want to read the next one from chapter 3? Alice or Wanda? Or I will if you don't. Don't feel obligated, but you're welcome to. Wanda, go for it.
Well, no, full disclosure, I'm riding my exercise bike right now. But
Good
this
for
is
you. Good for
what
you.
what a
Yes.
wonderful way to do it. So I can't see the screen from my bike to
Okay.
read. Otherwise I
No,
would.
no worries. You should, yeah, I'm often doing Qigong during in-services, which is why
Okay.
my camera's off. So I get it. Okay, so chapter 3, the haiku is the moon, full round, swimming among stars. We drift below, hand in hand. And let's read a couple more. Susan, you want to read the one from chapter 10?
Sure. I want to comment about the one from chapter 3, though, because it makes me smile to remember. We were at a hot springs in southeastern Idaho, a natural hot springs outside. And Richard at that point wasn't seeing very well because of the brain swelling due to his cancer. And we were literally floating in the hot springs pool outside, and the moon rose over the canyon wall above us. And I pointed to it. It was full, so he could see it. It was big enough and bright enough that he could see it. And that was just a beautiful, beautiful moment.
Thank you for giving us that context.
And chapter 10 is a really bittersweet one for me because I had planned. I ran a workshop every year for writers called Write and Retreat, and we would go off to some magical, wonderful place and spend half the day on our writing and half the day adventuring in nature. And the year that he learned he had brain cancer, that we learned he had brain cancer, that winter I had planned what was to be, it was on our list, on our fridge of the places we'd like to go, was a writer's retreat on an island in the Sea of Cortez off Baja California del Sur in Mexico, Isla Espiritu Santo, Holy Spirit Island in the Sea of Cortez, which is a magical place where the desert of tree-type cacti, many-armed cacti, meets a subtropical sea with sea lions and whale sharks and all these whales and all these marvelous creatures. And I had planned a retreat, and it was full, and Richard had to be in Denver doing radiation, and he spoke Spanish, and I don't much. And I ended up going by myself and leaving him in Denver to his radiation treatment. His daughter came to be with him. So it was very, very bittersweet to be on this island that we had hoped to be on together as sort of a honeymoonish thing without him. And we were coming back to La Paz, where we departed from, the group of us. And I wrote this haiku in Spanish first, and then in English. Riding the waves, the wind sings of fish laughing.
I have two more here, so I'll read them and then you can give us however much context you want, Susan.
Well, first I want to say that according to my friend who is a co-author of the Haiku Handbook, which is one of the important Bibles of haiku, Penny Harder. She and her late husband Bill Higginson wrote the Haiku Handbook. Haiku, the rules we often use for it are actually not quite correct in English. They're meant for Japanese kanji characters. And so when we talk about 575, that's 5 kanji, 7 kanji, 5 kanji. And so in English, Penny told me, and this was permission that I loved and as you can tell, took great liberties with. In English, it doesn't really translate that way. It should be short, long, short, but it doesn't have to be 575. And I, of course, took liberties then with the short, long, short anyway. But so I
Oh, that's
stopped
wonderful. I
syllables.
did not know that. Thank you for teaching me
I
something.
didn't know either, and I was fascinated because I learned haiku in grade school, and it was very rigid. And when Penny told me that, I was like, yes, I can break the rules.
But you break the rules, even whichever rules, but you don't break the spirit of what the
Thank you.
haiku
That
is
was what I
supposed
was
to
hoping for.
Yeah.
Haiku were originally like a prequel to a longer poem. They were a scene setting chunk of poetry. So those 3 lines, the idea was they're supposed to allude to the season and also have a turn, some kind of surprise in them. And they're supposed to set the scene for the longer poem that would follow. I, of course, in the book used them at the end of a scene, a chapter. But my idea of using them was, as you said, as a counterpoint to that very factual, grounded beginning, and as a way to kind of capture some of the spirit, the emotion of the chapter. So chapter 15 is the chapter my mother dies in. And the haiku is storm clouds muffle peaks, snowflakes hiss on wind, you sleep. And it would be life fading, not
Oh,
fading.
sorry.
That's the kind of typo I always do and can't see in my own work. I'm
But
terrible at
live
proving
facing
my own
has
work.
an interesting
Well, yeah,
meaning.
yeah, it does. I mean, that's a what do you call that when you use a word that you didn't mean, but it has there's a word for that. It has another meaning that's also useful. So yes, life facing. In as I was writing that haiku, I was actually sitting with my mother's body after she died early in the morning on a very, very bitterly cold February morning in Denver. And I was facing her life and my life. And her life had faded by then. So my mom was an early riser always, and she chose early morning to die. She did not want to disturb my dad, who was still sleeping. She was sleeping in a hospital bed next to him. And my dad remembers that he heard her say something and he almost woke, but didn't quite wake. And then when he did wake later around 7 o'clock, um, she wasn't moving. And he touched her and he wasn't sure if she still had a pulse. He picked up the cell phone and called me. I was staying down the hall with Richard. Um, and I came racing down the hall in my PJs and I felt her wrist and she was warm, but she was gone. And by then my dad was in the kitchen pouring his orange juice and thinking about breakfast. Um, ever the practical Norwegian Scots guy, food was next.
Mm.
So I sat with mom and wrote that haiku in my head.
Storm clouds muffle peaks, snowflakes hiss on wind. You sleep. life fading. Mm. And the last one I picked, and I really picked these at random because I could have put all 20 something and we would have just done haiku. So these aren't the best, these are just random. Spooned in bed, stars wheel in night sky, spring sprouts in our hearts.
In our bedroom in the house that Richard built for us but didn't finish, he was a sculptor. There was always something more interesting to do than things like interior doors and trim and finishing the bathroom and stuff like that. But in the bedroom, our bed was under a skylight in the roof so that I could watch the stars at night when I couldn't sleep. And that was written after my mom died and we were back at home. And it was spring. And at that time, Richard's medical team was quite sure he was going to be the odd one who made it out through glioblastoma because he was very, very healthy. And then came brain swelling and 3 more brain surgeries, making a total of 5. And he didn't end up making it. But at that moment, spring was really sprouting in our hearts.
Thank you for giving us the behind the scene context for those haiku. And it's very effective in the memoir, the way you do begin with the odometer and then have this as a synthesis, really, of what the plot and the setting and the characters and all of those elements have shown us in the chapter, and then you distill it down to these beautiful haiku. So we have here 1, 2, 3, 4 selections that you will read just a few minutes each, and I'm not sure we'll have time for all of them. So what one would
Probably
you like
not. To start? I would like to start with the beginning because I like to start there in the book. And part of it is a teaching thing. Since I teach writing workshops, I'm always thinking about my writing in terms of what it can teach. And one of the things I want to say about memoir is that I think the best memoirs are a combination of the authors. Well, I shouldn't say the best memoirs, but I think one thing that's very effective in memoir is when the author is able to go from get kind of the narrator voice, setting, where you are, the dialogue and that kind of thing, to both an expert voice, which in my case would be some science about whatever's happening, whether that's neurology or botany or whatever, to the reflective voice. And this segment at the beginning of chapter 1 really shows that well. It also shows something else that we often do in memoir, but not always. And that is you would never, well, that's not true. You would do it in fiction sometimes. It gives away the end at the beginning because there's no point making it a mystery. He's going to die. And the book is about how we deal with that, how we live with that. So, chapter 1, day 1, odometer reading 182 miles. Richard opened his eyes as I slowed the car for the turn to the gravel ranch road. I lowered the windows. Remember when we used to crank the windows down? When writing this book, I had to remind myself that now you press a button. I lowered the windows, letting in the rich smell of new mown hay, along with a distinctive throbbing call. Krrr, krrr. Sandhill cranes. A smile creased Richard's tanned face. He reached for my hand. I'm a lucky guy. The man sitting in the passenger seat next to me had moon face. And I want you to notice the voice there. I was just narrating, and I'm about to change from that. I'm about to go to a more almost expert voice. I'm taking you back from the immediate action to something else. The man sitting in the passenger seat next to me had moon face, the high cheekbones and chiseled profile gifted by a Cherokee Chickasaw ancestor, now rounded and puffy, a symptom of the steroids that controlled swelling from a growing brain tumor. His deep-set hazel eyes protruded. His muscly chest was soft, but when I looked at him, I saw only the mile-wide smile joyous and tinged with mischief, the same smile that had captivated me when we met some 29 years earlier, the smile that lit up everyone and everything around him. I felt a rush of love, a flood of oxytocin, see, there's the science, that excited and terrified me as much as it did when I first became his lover. Now I was his caregiver. He had terminal brain cancer, and we were setting off on a 4,000-mile belated honeymoon journey because our time together was short, because we were determined to live every moment. Scanning Richard's face, I was searching for grace. Okay, here comes the reflection, which to me is the ability to embrace life with a combination of balance, harmony, and beauty, the ability to be present, hearts open, even in, especially in, the moments when our hearts want to flinch, freeze, or turn away. When all seems lost, the wounded bird dies in our hands, the strayed child is not found safe and sound, the light of life on this animate planet flickers, as if to fade out. I swiped at tears with the hand that should have been holding the steering wheel and drove on toward the ranch headquarters, a cluster of white painted wooden buildings. I parked in our usual spot under the spruce tree by the bunkhouse. I'm going to haul our stuff upstairs. I can help. Richard pulled his 6-foot length slowly out of the car and then reached behind the seat for his briefcase. I grabbed our duffel, the box with his medications, my briefcase, and his pillow. We walked across the lawn and into the historic ranch house. I turned to go up the narrow stairs to the bedrooms. Richard stopped. "You go first," he said. Uh-oh. "Richard can manage the stairs, can't he?" Betsy, the facilities manager at Carpenter Ranch, had asked when I called about our stay. I relayed the question to him. "Of course." His voice carried the confidence of 61 years of having inhabited a muscular and appealingly male form. The voice of a man who could free climb a cliff, sculpt a 1-ton boulder, or juggle 3 balls while balancing on one leg. A man who could bound up that steep flight of steps, carrying our mound of gear. His sense of self hadn't changed, but his abilities had. This Richard froze at the bottom step, his tumor-impaired right brain struggling to make sense of how to ascend. I stopped at the top, arms loaded, watching with a stomach-churning mix of horror and fascination, compelled to witness the effects of the disease I could not stop. Finally, he reached for the handrail and took the steps slowly, one at a time, like an old man. When I was a child, and here's the reflective voice again, I knew love when Mom reached for my hand to help me up a steep bit of trail, or when Dad carried my knapsack once I tired. When my brother Bill, 2 years older and more popular than me, let me tag along. Love showed in my Granddad Milner's quirked eyebrow and dry banter when I challenged him at chess, and when he never let me win. I understood love as a partnership based on deep respect and affection. Now love meant fearlessly supporting my partner, the strong guy who still held my heart in his shaky hands.
I appreciate the way you wove your teaching into your reading of that and really makes it clear how you've woven the narrative with the reflection in a way that readers would not even be conscious of necessarily. As they read, the narrative would carry the
Yeah,
reflection.
thank you. If they were conscious of it, I would figure I hadn't done it right, right? You know, we want that to be subconscious. We want it to be just a natural part of how the story unfolds.
So, what I'd like to do, Susan, is to perhaps go back to another reading, but I want to make sure we do justice to these last 2 columns because I know that cultivating terraphilia and your current work is very important. And I want everyone to understand what this is. In fact, terraphilia, the word itself, you and Richard made up as part of a project you did together at, was it the Denver airport?
Yeah, it was part of an art exhibition that we were invited to participate in. The exhibit was called 33 Ideas. 33 for the 33 display cases on the sky bridge between the main concourse and Concourse A at the Denver International Airport. And each display case was to be the invited artists and writers, in my case, were invited to propose an idea related to Colorado or the West somehow for each display case, and then make an exhibit to fit into it. And when we got the prospectus for the art show inviting us to propose an entry, we were in Denver temporarily for Richard's radiation treatments for his brain cancer, and he was struggling to, it was the holidays, the winter holidays, and he was struggling to deal with the whole idea of brain cancer and wanted to be at home in his sculpture studio working. And I, of course, wanted to be at home. I was a freelance writer then, making a living and working on the deadlines I had, but we weren't. We were in Denver in a strange place, living in a strange house with other people. And he was getting daily radiation treatments to the brain. And so I was searching for something to raise his mood. And I remembered this invitation to participate in this art show. And I read it to him one day after his nap, and radiation wears you out. And he looked really sad. He said, there's a time when I would have loved to participate. And I said, it's okay, I can take the lead. Let's think of a word that relates to both of our work, my writing and his sculpture work. And we had never really collaborated before. And he said, okay. And we brainstormed some words and none of them stuck. And then as we were brushing our teeth that night before bed, he looked over at me with no preamble and said, he was really brilliant, and sometimes I couldn't follow. He said, terraphilia. And I looked at him and he said, terraphilia, like biophilia, but with the earth itself, not just loving the other lives, but the earth itself. And I nodded and I tried it out to see how it sounded, and I liked it. And we went hunting for it. I went hunting for it on the internet the next day and found it used only as a technical term in landscape architecture and some professional papers. And so I felt free to define it for us. And that became our word that defined our entry to the art show, and it ended up being our case in the exhibit at DIA for about 6 months the next year. And I defined it as an intrinsic affection for and connection to Earth and the planet's web of lives, human and more so. And then I added to the definition, without this deep bond, we are lonely, lacking, no longer whole. And for me, that really encapsulated the work that had driven both my science and my writing and my whole life. I believe I work to reconnect people with nature on a daily basis because I believe we're not human without that connection. And that in fact, a lot of the ills that we are dealing with right now, the greed and the anger and the anguish and the divisiveness are related to our disjunctness from the living world that is our home. And so that word became sort of a touchstone for us as we journeyed with Richard's brain cancer. And afterwards, as I picked up the threads of my life after he died, and it took me quite a while to come back to terraphilia because I was deeply in medical debt and I had to work out of it, and I was dealing with grief and all that stuff. But I kept coming back to this idea of terraphilia. And a couple of years ago, I started a Substack newsletter, and I call it Cultivating Terraphilia because its purpose is to allow me, a scientist, to talk about my emotional, spiritual, and physical connection to nature and why it's important to each of us on a daily basis. So I write about that in a newsletter based on Substack called Cultivating Terraphilia.
And I do believe I have the link for that somewhere. Maybe not, but
It's really easy to find if you just search for my name or
yes.
Cultivating Terraphilia.
And there's a free level too. So
yes, you can
there's no
subscribe to it
paywall.
without paying. It's
Yes.
actually, if people want to support me by paying, that's great, but I consider it part of my mission in life to reconnect all of us with nature. There's a whole growing field of research that shows all the benefits of vitamin N, as some people call nature exposure, that it range from helping us focus and concentrate, to lowering to the practical physiological things of lowering our blood pressure and blood sugar and helping us make better decisions, clarifying our thinking, encouraging self-compassion and compassion to others. So by just being outside for, I think the current research says 20 minutes a day in the more natural spot better. City streets don't work as well as a park. The wilder corners of a park work best. Say 3 times a week, we have we experience this whole range of physical, physiological, emotional, and intellectual benefits, and spiritual, I would say, benefits from reconnecting with nature. And it's free. And that's why it hasn't become a popular therapy in Western medicine, because you can't patent it and sell it for money. Excuse my cynicism. But my personal mission has been to teach people how to do that on an everyday basis.
My Qigong teacher reminds us frequently that just getting outside as early as possible and through a window doesn't work. Even just for 5 minutes, to let that natural light first thing in the morning enter our brains and through our eyes, enter our consciousness through our eyes, sets a tone for the entire day that encourages sanity and compassion and health and well-being.
And I would add to that, with all due respect for your Qigong teacher, through a window does work if that's all you have. Some of the earliest research on vitamin N was done in hospitals, and patients that have a view of something natural, even if it's just a tree growing out of a parking lot, recover more quickly from surgery, require fewer pain meds, and are less likely to need to be readmitted to the hospital.
That makes me feel good, because when it is 0 degrees here, I cop out and I look through the window.
And not all of us are able to get outside anymore. And having a window with something natural, it really helps. I have gone to the extent of, and I don't know if you can see this behind me, but I live with 3 plant companions. I don't generally do house plants, but I have 3 long-term plant companions, one of whom is a Christmas cactus who is the same age as I am, 69 this year. And I've had for many years and many moves. And in the winter, when the Christmas cactus, who has a name, Arabella, because she has magenta flowers that look like twirly ballet dancers, and so Arabella seemed appropriate. Arabella blooms from Thanksgiving to Easter. Arabella is still blooming behind me right now. She's got about 20 blooms on. In the height of the winter, she usually has about 100 every day. It's a big plant. And without that bright burst of color in the winter, my life would be a lot sadder, even though it's sunny where I live in the winter. It's just having that life going about their life that reminds me of the miracle that it is to wake up breathing every day.
Yes. I want to make sure we save time we're going to look back and then look forward here. So this book, Bless the Birds, is your 13th book. And I'm going to load this. Here is your selfie shelf. A shelf of your books. And so you've written a memoir, Walking Nature Home, A Life's Journey, Barren, Wild, and Worthless. That's a provocative title. Living in the Chihuahuan Desert, Pieces of Light, A Year on Colorado's Front Range, travel books, Colorado Scenic Byways, Colorado Less Traveled, and the San Luis Valley, nature essays, Barren, Wild, and Worthless, the San Luis Valley, Seasons of the Pacific Coast, Seasons of the Desert, and Pieces of Light, gardening books, the Rocky Mountain Gardening Survival Guide, nature guides, Meet with the Wild Southwest and the Great Southwest Nature Fact Book, and young adult books, Meet the Wild Southwest and City Foxes, as well as a nature journey journal, Pieces of Light. And here are the covers of all those books in an incredible list.
When people ask me what I write, I tick them off on my fingers. Nature, memoir, travel, gardening, kids. And they look at me like, because I don't pigeonhole well, as you might guess from what I talk about. And I have a new book coming out, which
Oh,
I'm
go
very
ahead.
excited about. And that
This
is,
book 14. I want to
yeah,
make sure we get to talk about this. And let's see when it is. I'm looking at my calendar here. On October 15th, you will be on my podcast talking
yes,
about this book right when it comes out.
I'm thrilled about that. It's
Me too.
actually due
Me too.
date is October 21st. Earthbound, and you can't tell from the cover, but Earthbound is it's my coming out as a scientist, essentially. Um, Earthbound is about nature and spirituality. It's a small book, it's 6 by 6, and it's full of my nature photos and 52 weeks of non-religious devotion. So a very short, I would call it a homily in appreciation of my friend, the Episcopal priest, a very short homily and then a practice for each week of how we can reconnect to nature. And they range from drying our clothes on clotheslines, the practical stuff, instead of using a dryer as much, to celebrating this turning of the seasons in the year, ways to celebrate that, to oh gosh, I don't have them all in my head right now. I did write the book. But it's 52 weeks of ways to reconnect with nature and short inspirational and scientific homilies. There's a homage to water. Um, there's haiku about the sound ice makes when it sings, as it warms up when the sun hits it. It's a, I have to say, it's a really beautiful little book. And it's designed, I think we're currently in production right now with the publisher, and I believe it's going to have, it's going to be like a sort of journal size that you could carry with you, and it's going to have a ribbon bookmark to mark the week you're in. Um, it starts with the week of winter solstice, as because for me that's the new year, the turning of fall into winter, and then it goes through a whole year, ending with the week before winter solstice.
And it's even yet another departure. You've written so many types of books, and
Yeah,
here's another type of book. And
and it
I
was
just want to go back to the Padlet here, and while we say goodbye in the next few minutes, because you mentioned the photographs, and you have such beautiful photographs on your website.
mm,
So I just want people to be able to look at those while we talk. So what were you about to say? I'm sorry to interrupt.
it really is for me. Earthbound is it's partly an outgrowth of the Substack because I did one of the first things I did on my newsletter was a year of um, spiritual thinking. So once a month, I would do a newsletter on some aspect that I was learning about, trying to understand my own kind of homegrown spirituality. I am a Quaker by affiliation, very loosely, but really my spirituality is earth-based, and I'm a little allergic to. I'm a little allergic to organized religion because it involves being inside, and for me, spirituality is outside in nature. It also involves being organized, and I'm a little allergic to organizations. Um, but that's just me. Um, I'm a scientist, and I never really talked about my own spirituality because it's not what I'm an expert in. I never felt like an expert. But after writing Bless the Birds, I realized that terraphilia and my spirituality are what helped me to be a loving, compassionate human being through what was one of the hardest years of my life. And so I started the Substack with the idea that I would kind of come out of the closet and write about spirituality, even though I'm not an expert in it. And I, so many people said to me, would you please write a book about this? And that the only way I could do it was to do it as the short essays over the course of a year. And I
I
don't know
can't
if you
wait.
can
I
you
can't
hear
wait.
the train whistle behind me? I don't know if you
No,
can hear it. There's a
no.
train going through my town. The irony of where I live is that up valley are, well, there's only one left, but there used to be six underground coal mines. It's low sulfur coal, so it's very in demand for power plants and coal power generation. Um, and every day, twice a day, 120 cars go up the valley empty and come back down full. And I have always loved the sound of train whistles, and I still do, even though that train going down the valley is full of anthracite coal from the earth of my valley, and it's going down valley to add to the carbon dioxide, eventually to add to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and further global climate change. And it still makes me smile when I hear the train whistle. It's one of
I
those
understand.
ironies.
I understand. Gosh, I can't believe it's 4:30. And any questions before we say goodbye? An hour was not long enough to talk to Susan Twite, but yeah, I will let you guys know when Susan will be back on to spend a whole hour talking about Earthbound and sharing photos and clips from Earthbound on my podcast in the fall. Any questions?
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say thank you so much
Yeah.
for your time. That was one of the best bike rides I've ever had, and I was looking out my window at the green. So, but thank you everybody for your time on this.
Thank
Yeah,
you, Rhonda.
I was going to say the same as Wanda. And my backyard, we feed the birds and the squirrels go in. But if the squirrels are clever enough to get and
Oh,
hang
yeah.
upside down, they're
Oh,
just
yeah.
so fun to watch. Like it's so I enjoy the nature thing too. And our campus is a bee campus. We have a seed library.
Great.
We're a tree campus. So it all embodies like you get a little frust at work. You just go walk outside and walk the
Yeah,
campus. So it made
that's
me think of all
wonderful.
of that as you're speaking. Thanks. Yep. Thank you.
That's
I
wonderful.
was so thrilled when I was hired by Washtenaw to know that there was a sustainable literacy task force and the work it did, and Students for Sustainability is a part of that. So it's a very, we have a food forest. It's a very green scene.
Wonderful. That's great. That's great. That's hopeful. It's things like that, hearing things like that. It's to me what will allow us to survive and thrive through these times is all of the local work that people are doing on their own as a community, bringing different kinds of people together um, to live in ways that are respectful and reciprocal with this marvelous numinous earth that we are gifted with.
Wonderful words to end by. Susan Twite, thank you for your time today and for your book, Bless the Birds. And I'm so glad that I've gotten to know you.
Carolyn, thank you, and thank you, Sandy. And thank you all for attending. What a treat this is. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you.
It was great.
Really.
No, thank you.